I'll be happy to address them. Yes, Brother Stark.
How long going in, do you have an idea how long that daughter work is going to remain a daughter work before it becomes a
You know, I have here in my notes, I use the same principle that Global Missions does. I look for self-governing, self-supporting, self-propagating. And I've done it as little as a year. That's very unusual. And I've done it where it was 10 years or more, because it really just depends on the situation. But I look for self-governing. So you have to have some lay leadership. And typically, now here's what I did. When we made a church self-governing, I set up a church board with 3 board members. The pastor, I as the senior pastor, and 1 lay leader. So they had to have at least 1 mature lay leader other than the pastor. And the reason I did it this way, it was only temporary, but if you notice that structure, the local church was in control of its own governance because it had 2 out of 3. But the 2 ministers were in control of the governance because they were 2 out of 3. So if some unforeseen problem happened once that church got on its own, I am the now former daughter work, now pastor, could effectively head off any problems. So when that pastor would tell me maybe a year or 2 later, well, Brother Bernard, I think I've got someone else that I can put in your place, I would happily step aside. It wasn't about retaining control, it was about protection of that pastor. So you need, in addition to a board member, you need some that like Sunday school teachers, whatever. So you look for leadership within the local church. You don't want the mother church supplying all the leaders. They're not ready to be self-governing. Second thing is self-supporting. So I expected that they were able to pay, if they're paying rent or whatever, that they were covering their own expenses. They weren't being subsidized. And then the third thing, self-propagating. They're growing through their own outreach. So initially, the mother church might be supplying Bible study teachers, and all the growth might be generated by the activities of mother church people on loan to them or helping them. Well, they're not ready. But once they have those 3 criteria, then they would be ready to go on their own. Usually, I would say a realistic thing might be 3 to 5 years. But in certain circumstances, it could be accelerated, or in other circumstances, and for instance, the one that we did just after a year or so, it was a town 2 hours away. The pastor had been a resident for many years, but he felt called to preach. He started the church. So he already had the networks. He had people in the community that were donating. And it was 2 hours away. It was really too far for our people to help him. So after a year, he was ready to go on his own. On the other hand, we had another daughter work in a very depressed area. We were able to get a very good building at a low price, but we never could get a resident pastor who could get a job in that community. So for years, and still, I think it's still a daughter work because we can't get resident ministry, and so we have people who commute and keep the church alive. So, sure.
I don't mean to take us out of the scope of what you're saying, but sometimes we have churches in our districts, I'll just keep it named, where we have lost churches for various reasons.
Yes.
We're doing daughter work for good reasons, and the net effect numerically is just that. It's no increase in the number of churches. So I guess I'm across Brother Bernard. Is there some cases where a established church reverts back to a daughter work?
Yes.
When it comes to the rescue?
Yes. Now, this is what we did, and this is one of the beauties of the daughter work concept. With the 16 I've told you about and others beyond that, there have been times where there was a pastoral transition. If that daughter work had been autonomous, it probably would have closed down. But because, and there are many reasons for pastoral transition. One could be health, it could be family circumstances, a job. And so most of the time when it's a daughter work, we can salvage that, because if that pastor has to resign and leave, we can just keep sending people from the mother church, or even have a temporary person from the mother church until such time as we identify a pastor, whether from locally or even from outside. So, and then there were times we did this with daughter works even after they became self-governing. And I always told the district, and Pastor Shaw, who's the pastor now, he always works with the district. Once it's a self-governing church, then of course the district steps in. But the district is very happy to get help. So if it's one of our former daughter works, even though they're self-governing, they're going to contact Brother Shaw and say, hey, can you help us out here? Can you cover it until we get someone? Or do you have someone in mind? Do you know someone who's interested? And so that relationship still exists. And then further, I would say, sometimes there are small churches that never were daughter works, but they're struggling. The pastor retires, the pastor dies, and maybe the way to keep that church open is to turn it into a daughter work. So I would say, now that could be done by the congregation itself voting, asking the district, we need help. And usually what happens is they try to get a pastor, they can't. And so maybe the district would say, hey, there's a neighboring church here who would be glad to help you out if you will agree to become a daughter work, and then the district board approve it. And sometimes there's maybe a building and no faithful people left. The district just steps in and recruits a neighboring pastor to take it over. So that, to me, is a way to salvage a lot of churches that otherwise would close down. Yes. Yes.
Question about working in rural areas. So some of the highly populated areas seem to have more churches. People are coming into those, but we still have a lot of churches that are in rural areas. Can you make an application to rural areas?
Yes. Well, I think the daughter work concept works great, because let's say you have a town of 10,000 people and no church. It's going to be very hard to recruit somebody to move there, relocate their family, get a job. But if it's within a driving distance of a strong church, and that strong church has young ministers who are eager to preach, and maybe they're trying to qualify for ministerial license, well, you could start, and if you start with an outreach and just let it grow to the next level based on the demand. Again, I'm kind of using a market terminology. So if it's just a Bible study and they're just a handful, you just keep it that way. But if it grows, the demand requires it, you make it a preaching point. You go to the next level. You make it a daughter work. But you could still operate from the mother church, and even though you'd like to see it self-governing, you could go for years like that with young ministers from your church. And what I would do in some of those cases, I would appoint even a senior minister or a retired minister to kind of be the overseer or the coordinator. So that gave some stability and some wisdom. But then we could use different young ministers to fill the slots. So it's good to have one contact person or one overseer. But that could be a way to raise up a church until it's strong enough that somebody could move there and be at least partially supported by that group. So I think it works well in a rural setting or a small town setting, as long as you have a mother church within whatever radius you think is reasonable, but say a 50-mile radius where the ministers can commute. And usually smaller churches are more flexible. You could have a service that is compatible with the mother church's schedule. So we would do anywhere from Saturday night, Sunday morning, Sunday afternoon, or Sunday night. And so they could operate a church schedule, and even the senior pastor could go there from time to time. And he could actually be the pastor of both churches if that's what was needed. And I see that as a way to start in a small community. Yeah. Yes.
How long before your initial church plant began to have daughter work? So you went to Austin.
Yeah, it was 7 years. We started, as I told you, our first effort was Spanish speaking, and it failed. I had an internal person, but he didn't really have the capability, so that failed. Then I recruited an external person, and he proved to be unreliable. That didn't work. But after 7 years, we were finally able to raise up a Spanish-speaking minister who could sustain it. But then after that first one, we started doing one or two a year because our church was growing. And I will say this. You do, like if you think of 16 daughter works, just take those pastors and their families, multiply that. That's a significant number of people and tithing. If you consider that maybe an average of one other family as their assistant or as helper, well, that's quite a few. And then if you consider there are going to be some unintentional transfers, that once that's going, there's somebody that lives nearby, no matter what you say, they're going to want to go there, and you don't want to crack the whip. So for 16, you could easily have 3 or 4 families for each one that you lose. So that is a worry and a fear, and that's legitimate. But here's what I would say. The mother church continued to grow more than that. I don't think the mother church would have grown that much had there not been that flow. Like for today, the mother church would have approximately 1,000. All those other churches put together would have approximately 1,000. I do not think if we didn't start any daughter work, we'd have 2,000 people. There's no way. So it ended up not hurting the mother church because the mother church continued to grow. And I think the training, the involvement, the outreach actually helped the mother church to grow. For instance, a large church may have a number of people who are capable musicians. Maybe some older people who play the piano, but they don't play the latest style. Well, a daughter work of 20 people would be glad to have that person play the piano. So you can multiply musicians and other workers who never intend to leave the mother church, but they go once a week to this other location and feel very rewarded. They're in turn more committed to the mother church because they are involved. And younger people like that get trained. I had all of my kids help out in daughter works at different times. They were trained in ministry in a small church setting that they would not have had at where the place that our church had arrived. So if it's done right, I think you can calibrate it so that it doesn't hurt the growth of the mother church. And I would argue even enhances, keeps the revival spirit so that the mother church is actually growing more than if you didn't have it. Because no matter how great the church is, it's hard to sustain a revival thrust every year, every season, all the time. But with the daughter work concepts, you can do that. Yeah.
If the initial church plant started with like a solid church planting team,
Yes.
could you see starting daughter work sooner than 7 years?
Yes.
I think if you had like, so if the mother started with 5 strong apostolic families, and some of them were already like
Yeah.
this, could you perceive perhaps having daughter work sooner?
Yeah, I think it's all based on individual. Here's the thing. A daughter work, the way I've described it, doesn't have to start with a heavy investment of cash. Our first daughter works had very small outlays of cash because we're basically depending on someone who's in the church, who's got a full-time job, and we're either, sometimes they get a free facility or very small with like another church's facilities, a school, storefront, even a home. So it would be very minimal cost, and if there was a cost, the mother church could perhaps guarantee it. But one of the first things you do as you start getting people is say, well, we're going to take up an offering just to cover the rent, utilities. So most people can understand that. And so even if they're not really committed to the church, they'll give a little in the offering. So what we found under that model, this outreach model, you could actually plant a daughter work with a very little initial investment. And what I try to tell the pastor is, look, let's grow it like this, and as tithing comes in, let's just set it aside in the fund. And if you need to be part-time or full-time, we can consider a housing allowance, but let's also consider a building fund. And so I'd talk to them, and most of them would say, hey, I'll keep my job or my wife or whatever. Let's just put this money aside for a building. And then I would say, look, when you really get ready to buy land or a building or make some major change, we'll go to the mother church and ask for an offering. And they all know you. They all see what's going on. And I even had businessmen in the church that caught the vision, and they would give, major offerings specifically for a building program. Now, later, when we got more intentional, the first daughter works were just opportunistic, an existing contact or someone who was called to ministry that lived in an area, and we just exploited that at minimal cost. But later, we started being very strategic. Okay, what areas of town are not being served? What suburbs are not being and so what we did there is then we did establish a budget and recruited a minister to come in and would say, okay, we're going to give you $1,000 a month for 12 months. And after 12 months, we're going to reevaluate it. That requires a little bit more significant investment. So I would say the church has to be a little stronger to do those kind of plans. Okay, all right. Let's take the break.